Morena Hoama. Welcome to day 26 of our alert level 4 lockdown as Aotearoa New Zealand Aorahui to keep everybody safe and to eliminate the spread of COVID-19. Actually, an attempt to eliminate COVID-19 from our country once and for all, and to make sure that everybody's health is valued and looked after. It is, of course, Monday the 20th of April, and you may be aware, if you've been hanging out on social media at least, that there are a whole lot of reckons floating about what comes next, about the kinds of decisions that may be made later today with regard to the Prime Minister and which alert level we move into. On that point, I'd just like to say, because I'm anticipating a few people, if you have been hanging out on social media, are likely to be interested in that question. Morena Tracy. Please just know that the best possible advice is going to be adhered to. It's been made incredibly transparent what those kind of yardsticks and what the criteria are that are going to be taken into account by this weekend. And it is ultimately going to be a decision for the best public health outcomes for all of us. Morena as well to Paul and to Frederick. I also just wanted to touch really briefly on something which has consistently been brought up throughout this process with all of us. We've got a question here from Frederick about what's it like being a university student as a parliamentarian. So for those of you who aren't aware, I did graduate, Frederick, with a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and a law degree way back at the start of 2016. But I, whilst being a parliamentarian, along with a few others, did undertake studying a postgraduate certificate in public policy with an intention to get a formal education in economics in particular, because I have read a heck of a lot and sought to teach myself a heck of a lot over the past few years. But as I've found, it is the case that people don't necessarily easily come to understand that right-wingers might not easily come to understand that those who have progressive ideas are well versed in the way that the economy works. Which brings me to a really good point that Kate Raworth, who is an Oxford economist and the author actually of Donut Economics, which is a fantastic book about how we can completely reorient our economy such that we do not end up with a situation where some people are falling short or receiving less than is required to survive, and that we're not overshooting planetary limits or boundaries, that being producing carbon emissions that completely change our atmosphere, that we're not excessively polluting or otherwise. Kate, an Oxford economist who is well renowned internationally for well-being economics, is going to be one of the 4 panellists headlining our debut Aotearoa Town Hall tonight, which you can find, I'll link it in the comments below somewhere, but you can also find it on my page if you look on the events section. And I also chucked up a meme by Zoe Spinks, who is had been a volunteer for my campaign in Auckland Central, and she found it hilarious that I decided to credit her for the creation of the meme, which was obviously an iteration of the formerly Drake meme, and she kind of made the point that it was absolutely unnecessary, to which I said that, as the Green Party spokesperson on arts, culture and heritage, I find it incredibly important to make sure that we credit artists where we can, including if that art is in the form of memes. On that point, this is of course a piece by Gina Keel, but alongside Kate tonight, you will also find Cara Dentis, who's an advisor on planning policy and iwi development, Louise Atkin from the Akina Foundation, who specialises in particular in the development of social enterprise, and old mate David Hall, who is a bit of a legend in a range of different academic fields, whether it is immigration or trees. He is a lecturer, a researcher, and an author on a number of different books. Myself, Marlon Drake, who you may remember as the author of that awesome piece on the living wage, which I shared on my page as well, and we spoke to in one of these earlier lives, will also be there, as well as Tale Bryant and Cleve Cameron. So you've got a jam-packed lineup for kind of reimagining the economy and what we can do moving forward, because as we all know, a huge amount of investment is going to be necessary. We are going to have to see some changes in how we do things. And that is why, among a raft of other ideas that are out there, knowing that new infrastructure is going to have to be built in the same way that, for example, the former national government decided to spend $12 billion on new roads in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis, we as the Greens have put out the idea that it'd make a heck of a lot of sense to connect up our regions and our cities and towns across the country in the North and South Island by high-speed rail. So that can help people who may, for example, be commuting, but also to make sure that people can visit their friends in whānau without the immense stress of needing to sit in traffic jams. You know, in the future, imagine going away for the long weekend without sitting in a massive traffic jam. There's some really funny ways of thinking about traffic and kind of ideology around roads that I first became exposed to when I ran for local government in 2016. And one of the things that blows my mind the most is the notion of thought, or the way of thinking that somehow simply by building more roads we're going to alleviate congestion. But what all research and actually experience of human beings using those roads shows us is that building more roads is like loosening a belt to lose weight. It is essentially induced congestion. It doesn't solve the fundamental problems, which is that people don't have alternatives to get around. In fact, it makes more people reliant on cars, as that is the only mode by which people may be able to get around if you're focused solely on building one mode of transport. The way that it was put by a fantastic young Green, Luke Weejohn, who was actually a former school strike leader in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, is, you know, imagine the freedom that you felt when you first got your car, when you first got your license and had the ability to drive around whenever you wanted to. Imagine what it would be like if you always had that freedom. Imagine what it would be like if growing up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, you had the ability to use safe, reliable and convenient public transport at any time. Imagine how cool that would be. It wouldn't have to be this bizarre rite of passage that you waited until you were XYZ old and had however much resources in your bank account. And instead, that would be a far more equitable future to imagine, right? And we've got a few questions and comments in here. Some people saying happy 420 day. It is in fact, yes, it is the 20th of April today, but in the United States, because they put their month before the date of the day, it comes to be that it is 420 day in the United States, which of course proliferates around the rest of the world. So yes, ka pai to everybody who's saying that we should absolutely be moving towards an end of cannabis prohibition and towards legalization and control. On this point, I just do need to raise it because somebody was chatting about it in yesterday's video around why I'm advocating for legalizing cannabis. And on that point, we just really need to unpack the premise to begin with, which is that almost all of us can agree that cannabis, even if you're pro-cannabis legalization, can agree that cannabis can cause harm in the same way that any substance can cause harm. If we accept that that is the premise, any substance can cause harm, cannabis can cause harm, then the next question needs to be, how do we best reduce that harm? And we do not best reduce that harm through the method of prohibition that we have undertaken for the past 40 years. In fact, it has pushed the substance, the users of it, and the people who are selling it further and further into the shadows. It has given us a complete lack of control over the potency, the ramifications, or the outcomes of use. And it has absolutely disabled us from the ability to have meaningful education about using it or moving away from using it. And nobody's going to put their hands up and ask for help if they risk going away in handcuffs. Which brings us to the second point around the distinction between decriminalisation and legalisation. Decriminalisation is simply a removal of penalties for the people who are using the substance. Legalisation is actually imposing a duty of care on the person who is selling the substance and opening up avenues for assistance or help to those who are using it. It also allows us to put in place forms of regulation on the substance itself. Right now, if we were to decriminalise tomorrow, people still wouldn't know exactly what they were getting. And there are a raft of problems that you can begin to investigate there, whether it is the likes of the synthetics crisis or otherwise. So what we have right now is chaos. It is the worst of all worlds. And you also, on top of all of that harm, have the added criminal justice, so-called criminal justice, and social harm of criminalisation. In that 80% of New Zealanders will try cannabis by the time they're 21 years old, but only a small fraction of those will be exposed to the criminal justice system. I personally come from the standpoint that I'm not comfortable with anybody being exposed to the criminal justice system when a health approach would be far better at producing a meaningful, healthy outcome for society and for that person. But the disproportionate targeting of certain communities that are predominantly Mārie and Pacifica, predominantly basically young brown men, have allowed us to perpetuate this myth about the way that cannabis prohibition has worked. Most people simply do not have interactions with the criminal justice system, which enables us to uphold this mythology around that's where bad people go. But actually, if cannabis laws were being applied on an equitable basis, all of us pretty much in this country would have been dragged before the courts for our cannabis use. So I'd ask everybody to reflect on that. If you think that prohibition is working and you have used cannabis, then I'm not going to go so far as to call you a hypocrite, but I am going to say that perhaps you should be reflecting on how unjust and unfair and the system is actually not working. Elsie is saying she's not looking forward to the first day of uni online today. Kia kaha, all strength to you, whānau. Sam is asking about my deer shirt. Yes, this is an old school deer shirt. The reason that I wear this deer shirt, and actually it's kind of a bit of a funny one for anybody who's been engaged in the drug law reform space for any given period of time. I went to Vienna to the UN last year for the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is actually the birthplace of prohibition of all substances, criminalisation, and all of the problems that we've seen as a result. One of the greatest ironies was that when we as a international community came together and decided that we would increase and ratchet up penalties for use of substances in particular, we told ourselves, this was in 1998, that if we all adhered to this, we all continued to increase penalties, then we would, in 10 years, completely eliminate drugs from planet Earth. That is hilarious to anybody who has followed the data, the research, or simply has common sense on this issue, because instead of eliminating drugs from planet Earth by 2008, in fact, we have multiplied not only those substances, but the harm associated to them, because we have continued to push them further and further underground into the hands of people who are completely unregulated, that being the black market, potentially pushing further profits into other forms of criminal activity, violence or otherwise. But back to the deer shirt. There are a ton of people in the NGO or community sector space who sat, watching all of these different jurisdictions, these different countries at the UN Vienna Convention, getting up and saying, we have XYZ amount more deaths as a result of substance abuse. We have more people in prison. The problem is getting worse. We have more people dealing. All of these problems are happening under prohibition. We have to keep doing more of what we've been doing and doing it harder. I mean, I don't know about you, but doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is the definition of stupidity. So it was just mind-blowing, all of us who have a more progressive, evidence-based approach, watching this kind of really highly politicized, ideology-led approach from different politicians in particular. And unfortunately, we still have a lot of that entrenched here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But the DARE shirt, DARE is Drug Abuse Resistance Education. It came out in the 1990s, 1980s in the United States. And funnily enough, I absolutely agree with the terminology drug abuse resistance education. The problem is that what DARE became was not drug abuse resistance education. It became abstinence-based teaching, which in turn didn't teach kids anything meaningful about what substances are, what they do to you, and how to avoid that harm. In fact, they just preached in much the same way that we used to preach abstinence-based sex education. You know, don't touch this because you will die if you do that. And obviously that hyperbole is not believed by kids, and in turn it erodes that respect for authority, which ultimately becomes mega problematic when it comes to trying to get people to meaningfully follow laws or regulations or understand why they exist in the first place. So I fundamentally believe in drug harm reduction, but the kind of drug abstinence, for lack of a better term, program that was run by DARE, particularly out of the United States, funnily enough, was evaluated by researchers, and what was found is that kids who had engaged in the DARE program were more likely on average than those who didn't to engage in risky substance use. So, you know, if you need a test of efficacy of scaremongering and moral panic and not actually doing anything meaningful to tackle these problems, then that's it. A few more questions. Tracy, thank you from the day you read the bill in Parliament. You and the Greens had my vote. Ka pai and kia ora, Tracy. What is, speaking about Winter Wonderland train to the Central North Island Maungas for skiing, wouldn't that be cool? Imagine getting on a train and having no stress and going off to your holiday around the rest of the country. Notably, there are a number of people who are bringing up questions right now about how we kind of revive jobs or bring back a sense of economic activity, particularly to our smaller regions, as we come out the other side of COVID-19. And they're worried about the decrease in particular of international tourism. We have an amazing backyard here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and connecting it up with train transit will enable all of us to explore that. There are a number of people who are commenting on the post the other day about this announcement from the Greens that we are advocating for, that they would have loved to have gone, for example, to travel the deeper south or to go around the rest of the North Island, but had been limited in doing so by the cost of petrol, for example. So I just want people to reflect on that as well, that this is about access, it's about convenience, and it is ultimately about inclusivity, making sure everybody has the ability to do this. I've got to get on my morning call soon, so I just want to say thank you all for listening. I've got a whole bunch of comments in here which I will seek to get back to over the course of the next little while. Someone's asking about tattoos. Yes, I do have a few tattoos, and this is a native bee, everybody. This is a native sweat bee. The cool thing about these native sweat bees, my partner who's from Australia thinks it's hilarious, but they don't live in hives, they live in little holes in the ground, and they are responsible for pollinating our native plants here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And they're a massive threat from industrial agriculture and the chemicals that are used in that process, but also as a result of deforestation. So again, remember, guys, I will stop ranting now, but stay safe, stay inside, stay indoors, stay home. Be kind, especially to yourselves, and save lives. We'll see you all again tomorrow at 8:10. This is Gina Keel. I've been Chloe Swarbrick. You've all been fantastic. Have a lovely day.